Greetings once again, loyal librarians. Welcome back to WikiSpeaks, the audio service created with the sole intention of providing easily accessible information about any and all topics and articles found on your neighborhood-friendly Wikipedia page. My name, as always, is Ospelak, and today's topic, for your listening pleasure, the Battle of Tarawa. I apologize for how long it's been since I've put a video out. The last one I did was about the RMS Titanic. It's been actually about a week. I've been absolutely banging it hard at work. I work in a warehouse environment, and we've been completely hammered with pick, pack, and shipping orders, receiving pallets of goods that we need to put into our system and put back out and onto our shelves, and then our quality assurance, quality control table. We're so far behind. We're doing 11-hour days about 2 months now, and it's finally starting to take its toll. And so every day after work, I get home about 5:30, and I'm just so tired. I don't really have the energy to make a video. I'm going to try to rectify that soon, and hopefully the work schedule, things will calm down and we can go back to our normal sort of 7.5 hour days, at which point I can get home earlier and I still have energy to put some videos out for you. With that being said, I'll refer you to my disclaimer video for your convenience or inconvenience if you want to listen to it. And with that being said, I'll only say that the contents of this recording are the sole property of Wikipedia.com, with all rights, privileges, and credit going to that establishment. And may God have mercy on their soul. And now, for your listening pleasure, for your consideration, the Battle of Tarawa. The Battle of Tarawa, U.S. codename Operation Galvanic, was a battle in the Pacific theater of World War II, and was fought from November 20 to November 23, 1943. It took place at the Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. Nearly 6,400 Japanese, Koreans, and Americans died in the fighting, mostly on and around the small island of Beshio. The Battle of Tarawa was the first American offensive in the critical Central Pacific region. It was also the first time in the war that the United States faced serious Japanese opposition to an amphibious landing. Previous landings met with little or no initial resistance, but this time the 4,500 Japanese defenders were well supplied and well prepared, and they fought almost to the last man, exacting a heavy toll on the United States Marine Corps. The U.S. had suffered similar casualties in other campaigns, for example, over the 6 months of the Guadalcanal campaign, but in this case the losses were incurred within the space of 76 hours. Background. In order to set up forward air bases capable of supporting operations across the mid-Pacific to the Philippines and into Japan, the U.S. needed to take the Mariana Islands. The Marianas were heavily defended. Naval doctrine of the time held that in order for attacks to succeed, land-based aircraft would be required to weaken defenses and protect the invasion forces. The nearest islands capable of supporting such an effort were the Marshall Islands, northeast of Guadalcanal. Taking the Marshalls would provide the base needed to launch an offensive on the Marianas, but the Marshalls were cut off from direct communication with Hawaii by a garrison and air base on the small island of Beshio, on the western side of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. Thus, to eventually launch an invasion of the Marianas, the battles had to start far to the east, at Tarawa. Following the completion of their campaign on Guadalcanal, the 2nd Marine Division had been withdrawn to New Zealand for rest and recuperation. Losses were replaced, and the men given a chance to recover from the malaria and other illnesses that weakened them through the fighting in the Solomon Islands. On July 20, 1943, the Joint Chiefs directed Admiral Chester Nimitz to prepare plans for an offensive operation in the Gilbert Islands. In August, Admiral Raymond Spruance was flown down to New Zealand to meet with the new commander of the 2nd Marine Division, General Julian Smith, and initiate the planning of the invasion with the division's commanders. Located about 2,400 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor, Beshio is the largest island in the Tarawa Atoll. The small, flat island lies at the southernmost reach of the lagoon, and was home to the bulk of the Japanese defenders. Shaped roughly like a long, thin triangle, The tiny island is approximately 2 miles long. It is narrow, being only 800 yards wide at the widest point. A long pier was constructed from the north shore from which cargo ships could unload out past the shallows while at anchor in the protection of the lagoon. The northern coast of the island faces into the lagoon, while the southern and western sides face the deep waters of the open ocean. Following General Evans Carlson's diversionary Makin Island raid of August 1942, the Japanese command was made aware of the vulnerability and strategic significance of the Gilbert Islands. The 6th Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force arrived to reinforce the island in February 1943. In command was Rear Admiral Tomonari Saichiro, an experienced engineer who directed the construction of the sophisticated defensive structures on Beshio. Upon their arrival, the 6th Yokosuka became a garrison force, and the unit's identification was changed to the 3rd Special Base Defense Force. Saichiro's primary goal in the Japanese defensive scheme was to stop the attackers in the water or pin them on the beaches. A tremendous number of pillboxes and firing pits were constructed with excellent fields of fire over the water and sandy shore. In the interior of the island was the command post and a number of large shelters designed to protect defenders from air attack and bombardment. The island's defenses were not set up for a battle in depth across the island's interior. The interior structures were large and vented, but did not have firing ports. Defenders in them were limited to firing from the doorways. The Japanese worked intensely for nearly a year to fortify the island. To aid the garrison in the construction of the defenses, the 1,247 men of the 111th Pioneers, similar to the Seabees of the United States Navy, along with 970 men of the 4th Fleet's Construction Battalion, were brought in. Approximately 1,200 of the men in these two groups were Korean forced laborers. The garrison itself was made up of forces of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Special Naval Landing Force was the Marine component of the IJN, and were known by U.S. intelligence to be more highly trained, better disciplined, more tenacious, and to have better small unit leadership than comparable units in the Imperial Japanese Army. The 3rd Special Base Defense Force assigned to Tarawa had a strength of 1,112 men. They were reinforced by the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, with a strength of 1,497 men. It was commanded by Commander Takeo Sugai. This unit was bolstered by 14 Type 95 light tanks under the command of Ensign Otani. A series of 14 coastal defense guns, including 4 large Vickers 8-inch guns purchased during the Russo-Japanese War from the British, were secured in concrete bunkers and located around the island to guard the open water and the approaches into the lagoon. It was thought these big guns would make it very difficult for a landing force to enter the lagoon and attack the island from the north side. The island had a total of 500 pillboxes, or stockades, built from logs and sand, many of which were reinforced with cement. 40 artillery pieces were scattered around the island in various reinforced firing pits. An airfield was cut into the bush straight down the center of the island. Trenches connected all points of the island, allowing troops to move where needed under cover. As the command believed their coastal guns would protect the approaches into the lagoon, an attack on the island was anticipated to come from the open waters of the western or southern beaches. Rear Admiral Kaiji Shibazaki, an experienced combat officer from the campaigns in China, relieved Saichiro on July 20, 1943, in anticipation of the coming combat. Shibazaki continued the defensive preparations right up to the day of the invasion. He encouraged his troops, saying, quote, "It would take 1 million men 100 years," end quote, to conquer Tarawa. Battle, November 20. The American invasion force of the Gilberts was the largest yet assembled for a single operation in the Pacific, consisting of 17 aircraft carriers, 6 CVs, 5 CVLs, and 6 CVEs, 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 66 destroyers, and 36 transport ships. On board the transports was the 2nd Marine Division and part of the Army's 27th Infantry Division, for a total of about 35,000 men. As the invasion flotilla hove to in the pre-dawn hours, the island's 4 8-inch guns opened fire on the task force. A gunnery duel soon developed as the main batteries on the battleships USS Colorado and USS Maryland commenced counter-battery fire. The counter-battery proved accurate, with several of the 16-inch shells finding their marks. One shell penetrated the ammunition storage for one of the guns, igniting a huge explosion as the ordnance went up in a massive fireball. 3 of the 4 guns were knocked out in short order. Though all 4 guns fell silent, one continued intermittent, though inaccurate fire throughout the second day. The damage to the big guns left the approach to the lagoon open. It was one of the few successes of the naval bombardment. Following the gunnery duel and an air attack of the island at 06:10, the naval bombardment of the island began in earnest and was sustained for the next 3 hours. 2 minesweepers with 2 destroyers to provide covering fire entered the lagoon in the pre-dawn hours and cleared the shallows of mines. A guide light from one of the sweepers then guided the landing craft into the lagoon, where they awaited the end of the bombardment. The plan was to land Marines on the northern beaches, divided into 3 sections: Red Beach 1 on the far west of the island, Red Beach 2 in the center just west of the pier, and Red Beach 3 to the east of the pier. Green Beach was a contingency landing beach on the western shoreline and was used for the D+1 landings. Black Beaches 1 and 2 made up the southern shore of the island and were not used. The airstrip, running roughly east-west, divided the island into north and south. The Marines started their attack from the lagoon at 0900, 30 minutes later than expected, but found the tide had still not risen enough to allow their shallow draft Higgins boats to clear the reef. Marine battle planners had not allowed for Becio's neap tide and expected the normal rising tide to provide a water depth of 5 feet over the reef, allowing their 4-foot draft Higgins boats room to spare. On this day and the next, the ocean experienced a neap tide and failed to rise. The neap tide phenomenon occurs twice a month, when the moon is near its first or last quarter. In a neap tide, the countering tug of the sun counteracts the pull of the moon, and water levels deviate less. In this instance, the moon was at its farthest distance from the earth and exerted even less than normal gravitational pull, leaving the waters relatively undisturbed. In the words of some observers, quote, "The ocean just sat there," end quote, leaving a mean depth of 3 feet over the reef. Excuse me. At 0900, the supporting naval bombardment was lifted to allow the Marines to land. The reef proved a daunting obstacle. Only the tracked LVT Alligators were able to get across. The Higgins boats, at 4 feet draft, were unable to clear the reef. With the pause in the naval bombardment, those Japanese that survived the shelling were again able to man their firing pits. Japanese troops from the southern beaches were shifted up to the northern beaches. As the LVTs made their way over the reef and into the shallows, the number of Japanese troops in the firing pits slowly began to increase, and the amount of combined arms fire the LVTs faced gradually intensified. The LVTs had a myriad of holes punched through their non-armored hulls, and many were knocked out of the battle. Those Alligators that did make it in proved unable to clear the seawall, leaving the men in the first assault waves pinned down against a log wall along the beach. A number of Alligators went back out to the reef in an attempt to carry in the men who were stuck there, but most of these LVTs were too badly holed to remain seaworthy, leaving the Marines stuck on the reef, some 500 yards offshore. Half of the LVTs were knocked out of action by the end of the first day. Colonel David Shoup was the senior officer of the landed forces, and he assumed command of all landed Marine Corps troops upon his arrival on shore. Although wounded by an exploding shell soon after landing at the pier, Colonel Shoup took charge of the situation, cleared the pier of Japanese snipers, and rallied the first wave of Marines who had become pinned down behind the limited protection of the seawall. During the next 2 days, working without rest and under constant, withering enemy fire, he directed attacks against strongly defended Japanese positions, pushing forward despite daunting defensive obstructions and heavy fire. Throughout, Colonel Shoup was repeatedly exposed to Japanese small arms and artillery fire, inspiring the forces under his command. For his actions on Beshio, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Early attempts to land tanks for close support and to get past the seawall failed when the LCM landing craft carrying them hung up behind the reef. Some of these craft were hit out in the lagoon while they waited to move in to the beach, and either sank outright or had to withdraw while taking on water. 2 Stuart tanks were landed on the east end of the beach but were knocked out of action fairly quickly. The battalion commander of 3rd Battalion, 2nd Regiment, found several LCMs near the reef and ordered them to land their Sherman tanks and head to Red Beach 2. The LCMs dropped ramps and the 6 tanks came down, climbed over the reef, and dropped into the surf beyond. They were guided into shore by Marines on foot, but several of these tanks fell into holes caused by the naval gunfire bombardment and sank. The surviving Shermans on the western end of the island proved considerably more effective than the lighter Stuarts. They helped push the line in to about 300 yards from shore. One became stuck in a tank trap, and another was knocked out by a magnetic mine. The remaining tank took a shell hit to its barrel and had its 75mm gun disabled. It was used as a portable machine gun pillbox for the rest of the day. A 3rd platoon was able to land all 4 of its tanks on Red 3 around noon and operated them successfully for much of the day, but by day's end only 1 tank was still in action. By noon, the Marines had successfully taken the beach as far as the first line of Japanese defenses. By 15:30, the line had moved inland in places, but was still generally along the first line of defenses. The arrival of the tanks started the line moving on Red 3 and the end of Red 2, the right flank as viewed from the north, and by nightfall the line was about halfway across the island, only a short distance from the main runway. In addition, Major Michael P. Ryan, a company commander, had gathered together remnants of his company with diverse disconnected Marines and sailors from other landing waves, as well as 2 Sherman tanks, and had diverted them onto a more lightly defended section of Green Beach. This impromptu unit was later referred to as Ryan's Orphans. Ryan, who had been thought to be dead, arranged for naval gunfire and mounted an attack that cleared the island's western end. The communication lines which the Japanese installed on the island had been laid shallow and were destroyed in the naval bombardment, effectively preventing Commander Keiji Shibazaki's direct control of his troops. In mid-afternoon, he and his staff abandoned the command post at the west end of the airfield to allow it to be used to shelter and care for the wounded, and prepared to move to the south side of the island. He had ordered 2 of his Type 95 light tanks to act as a protective cover for the move, but a 5-inch naval artillery shell exploded in the midst of his headquarters personnel as they were assembled outside the central concrete command post, resulting in the death of the commander and most of his staff. This loss further complicated Japanese command problems. As night fell on the first day, the Japanese defenders kept up sporadic harassing fire, but did not launch an attack on the Marines clinging to their beachhead and the territory won in the day's hard fighting. With Rear Admiral Shibazaki killed and their communication lines torn up, Each Japanese unit was essentially acting in isolation, and indeed had been since the commencement of the naval bombardment. The Marines brought a battery of 75mm pack howitzers ashore, unpacked them, and set them up for action for the next day's fight, but the bulk of the second wave was unable to land. They spent the night floating out in the lagoon without food or water, trying to sleep in their Higgins boats. A number of Japanese Marines slipped away in the night, swimming out to a number of the wrecked LVTs in the lagoon, and also to the Saudi Maru, a wrecked Japanese steamship lying west of the main pier. There they lay in wait for dawn, when they would fire upon the U.S. forces from behind. The long night dragged on, but lacking central direction, the Japanese were unable to coordinate for a counterattack against the toehold the Marines held on the island. The feared counterattack never came, and the Marines held their ground. By the end of the first day, of the 5,000 Marines put ashore, 1,500 were casualties, either dead or wounded. November 21st. With the Marines holding a thin line on the island, the focus of the second day was for the forces on Red Beach 2 and 3 to push inward and divide the Japanese defenders into two sections, expanding the bulge near the airfield until it reached the southern shore. Those forces on Red 1 were directed to secure Green Beach for the landing of reinforcements. Green Beach made up the entire western end of the island. The effort to take Green Beach initially met with heavy resistance. Naval gunfire was called in to reduce the pillboxes and gun emplacements barring the way. Inching their way forward, artillery spotters were able to direct naval gunfire directly upon the machine gun posts and remaining strongpoints. With the major obstacles reduced, the Marines were able to take the positions in about an hour of combat with relatively few losses. Operations along Red 2 and Red 3 were considerably more difficult. During the night, the defenders had set up several new machine gun posts between the closest approach of the forces from the two beaches, and fire from those machine gun nests cut off the American forces from each other for some time. By noon, the U.S. forces had brought up their own heavy machine guns, and the Japanese posts were put out of action. By the early afternoon, they had crossed the airstrip and had occupied abandoned defensive works on the south side. Around 12:30, a message arrived that some of the defenders were making their way across the sandbars from the extreme eastern end of the islet to Bariki, the next islet over. Portions of the 6th Marine Regiment were then ordered to land on Bariki to seal off the retreat path. They formed up, including tanks and pack artillery, and were able to start their landing at 16:55. They received machine gun fire, so aircraft were sent in to try to locate the guns and suppress them. The force landed with no further fire, and it was later found that only a single pillbox with 12 machine guns had been set up by the forces that had been assumed to be escaping. They had a small tank of gasoline in their pillbox, and when it was hit with fire from the aircraft, the entire force was burned. Later, other units of the 6th were landed unopposed on Green Beach, north, near Red Beach 1. By the end of the day, the entire western end of the island was in U.S. control, as well as a fairly continuous line between Red Beach 2 and Red Beach 3 around the airfield aprons. A separate group had moved across the airfield and set up a perimeter on the southern side, up against Black Beach 2. The groups were not in contact with each other, with a gap of over 500 yards between the forces at Red 1, Green and Red 2, and the lines on the northern side inland from Red 2 to Red 3 were not continuous. November 22nd. The third day of battle consisted primarily of consolidating existing lines along Red 1 and 2, an eastward thrust from the wharf, and moving additional heavy equipment and tanks ashore onto Green Beach at 0800. During the morning, the forces originally landed on Red 1 made some progress towards Red 2, but took casualties. Meanwhile, the 6th Marines, which had landed on Green Beach to the south of Red 1, formed up while the remaining battalion of the 6th landed. By the afternoon, the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines were sufficiently organized and equipped to take the offensive. At 12:30, they pressed the Japanese forces across the southern coast of the island. By late afternoon, they had reached the eastern end of the airfield and had formed a continuous line with the forces that landed on Red 3 2 days earlier. By the evening, the remaining Japanese forces were either pushed back into the tiny amount of land to the east of the airstrip, or operating in several isolated pockets near Red 1 and Red 2, and near the western edge of the airstrip. That night, the Japanese forces formed up for a counterattack, which started at about 19:30. Small units were sent in to infiltrate the U.S. lines in preparation for a full-scale assault. The assembling forces were broken up by concentrated artillery fire, and the assault never took place. Another attempt, a large banzai attack, was made at 0300 and met with some success, inflicting 173 casualties, including 45 dead. With support from the destroyers USS Schroeder and USS Sigsbee, the Marines killed 325 Japanese attackers. November 23rd. At 0510, one of the 17 supporting aircraft carriers, USS Liscombe Bay, was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine, with a loss of 687 of her complement. She had contributed her share of the air support for the Marines, but by the time of her sinking, her loss had no effect on the land battle. However, this loss was more than 30% of the total loss of life on the American side attributed to the Battle of Tarawa. At 0400, the Japanese attacked Major Jones's 1st Battalion, 6th Marines in force. Roughly 300 Japanese troops launched a banzai attack into the lines of A and B companies. Receiving support from 110's 75mm pack howitzers and the destroyers Schroeder and Sigsbee, the Marines were able to beat back the attack, but only after calling artillery to within 75 meters of their own lines. When the assault ended about an hour later, there were 200 dead Japanese soldiers in the Marine front lines, and another 125 beyond their lines. At 0700, Navy fighters and dive bombers started softening up the Japanese positions on the eastern tip of the island. After 30 minutes of air attack, the pack howitzers of 110 opened up on the Japanese positions. 15 minutes later, the Navy kicked off the last part of the bombardment with a further 15 minutes of shelling. At 0800, 3-6, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel McLeod, attacked, Jones's 1-6 having been pulled off the line after suffering 45 killed and 128 wounded in the previous night's fighting. Due to the narrowing nature of the island, I and L companies of 3-6 formed the entire Marine front, with K Company in reserve. The Marines advanced quickly against the few Japanese left alive on the eastern tip of Beshio. They had 2 Sherman tanks, the Colorado and the China Gal, 5 light tanks in support, and engineers in direct support. I and L companies advanced 350 yards before experiencing any serious resistance in the form of connected bunkers on I Company's front. Lieutenant Colonel McLeod ordered L Company to continue their advance, thereby bypassing the Japanese position. At this point, L Company made up the entire front across the now 200-yard wide island, while I Company reduced the Japanese strongpoint with the support of the tank Colorado and attached demolition flamethrower teams provided by the engineers. As the I Company Marines closed in, the Japanese broke from cover and attempted to retreat down a narrow defile. Alerted to the attempted retreat, the commander of the Colorado fired an enfilade at the line of fleeing soldiers. The near total destruction of the Japanese soldiers' bodies made it impossible to know how many men were killed by this single shot, but it was estimated that 50 to 75 men perished. While 3-6's L Company advanced down the eastern end of the island, Major Schotel's 3-2 and Major Hayes' 1-8 were clearing out the Japanese pockets that still existed between beaches Red 1 and Red 2. This pocket had been resisting the advance of the Marine landing on Red 1 and Red 2 since D-Day, and they had not yet been able to move against it. 1-8 advanced on the pocket from the east, Red 2, while 3-2 advanced from the west, Red 1. Major Hewitt Adams led an infantry platoon supported by 2 pack howitzers from the lagoon into the Japanese positions to complete the encirclement. By noon, the pocket had been reduced. On the eastern end of the island, 3/6's L Company continued to advance, bypassing pockets of resistance and leaving them to be cleared out by tanks, engineers, and air support. By 1300, they had reached the eastern tip of Beshio. 3/6 killed roughly 475 Japanese soldiers on the morning of D+3, while only losing 9 killed and 25 wounded. Back at the Red 1, Red 2 pocket, there was no accurate count of Japanese dead. There were an estimated 1,000 Japanese alive and fighting on the night of D+2, 500 on the morning of D+3, and only 50 to 100 left when the island was declared secure at 1330 D+3. Aftermath. For the next several days, the 2nd Battalion 6th Marines moved up through the remaining islands in the atoll and cleared the area of Japanese, completing this on November 28th. The 2nd Marine Division started shipping out soon after and were completely withdrawn by early 1944. Of the 3,636 Japanese in the garrison, only 1 officer and 16 enlisted men surrendered. Of the 1,200 Korean laborers brought to Tarawa to construct the defenses, only 129 survived. All told, 4,690 of the island's defenders were killed. The 2nd Marine Division suffered 894 killed in action, 48 officers and 846 enlisted men, while an additional 84 of the wounded survivors later succumbed to what proved to be fatal wounds. Of these, 8 were officers and 76 were enlisted men. A further 2,188 men were wounded in the battle, 102 officers and 2,086 men. Of the roughly 12,000 2nd Marine Division Marines on Tarawa, 3,166 officers and men became casualties. Nearly all of these casualties were suffered in the 76 hours between the landing at 0910 on the 20th of November and the island of Beshio being declared secure at 1330 on November 23rd. The heavy casualties suffered at Tarawa sparked public protest in the United States, where headline reports of the high losses could not be understood for such a small and seemingly unimportant island. The public reaction was aggravated by the unguardedly frank comments of some of the Marine Corps command. General Holland M. Smith, commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps, who had toured the beaches after the battle, likened the losses to Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Back in Washington, newly appointed Marine Corps Commandant General Alexander Vandergrift, the widely respected and highly decorated veteran of Guadalcanal, reassured Congress, pointing out that, quote, Tarawa was an assault from beginning to end, end quote. A New York Times editorial on December 27, 1943, praised the Marines for overcoming Tarawa's rugged defenses and fanatical garrison, and warned that future assaults in the Marshalls might well result in heavier losses. Quote, we must steel ourselves now to pay that price. End quote. Writing after the war, General Holland Smith, who in his biography was highly critical of the Navy, commented, quote, was Tarawa worth it? My answer is unqualified. No. From the very beginning, the decision of the Joint Chiefs to seize Tarawa was a mistake, and from their initial mistake grew the terrible drama of errors of omission rather than commission, resulting in these needless casualties. End quote. Some commanders involved, including Admiral Chester Nimitz, Admiral Raymond Spruance, Lieutenant General Julian C. Smith and Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup disagreed with General Smith. Said Nimitz, quote, "The capture of Tarawa knocked down the first door to the Japanese defenses in the Central Pacific." End quote. Nimitz launched the Marshall's Campaign 10 weeks after the seizure of Tarawa. Aircraft flown from airfields at Beshio and Apamama proved highly valuable, but the greater significance of the action on Tarawa to the success in the Marshalls proved to be the lessons learned from the battle itself. The losses at Tarawa resulted from contributing factors, among which were the miscalculation of the tide and the height of the obstructing coral reefs, the operational shortcomings of the landing craft available, the inability of the naval bombardment to weaken the defenses of a well-entrenched enemy, and the difficulties of coordinating and communicating between the different forces involved. It was the first time in the war that a United States amphibious landing was opposed by well-entrenched, determined defenders. Previous landings, such as the landings at Guadalcanal, had been unexpected and met with little or no initial resistance. At the time, Tarawa was the most heavily defended atoll invaded by Allied forces in the Pacific. All told, nearly 6,400 Japanese, Koreans, and Americans died on the tiny island in 76 hours of fighting. In the aftermath of the battle, American casualties lined the beach and floated in the surf. Staff Sergeant Norman T. Hatch and other Marine cameramen were present obtaining footage that would later be used in a documentary. With the Marines at Tarawa contained scenes of American dead so disturbing that the decision of whether or not to release it to the public was referred to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Following the battle, the 2nd Marine Division was shipped to Hawaii, leaving the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment behind to clear the battlefield of ordnance, provide security for the Seabees rebuilding the airstrip, and aid in the burial detail. The 2nd Marine Division remained in Hawaii for 6 months, refitting and training, until called upon for its next major amphibious landing, the Battle of Saipan in the Marianas in June 1944. The lessons learned at Tarawa would be applied to all subsequent amphibious assaults as the United States worked its way across the Central Pacific. Said war correspondent Robert Sherrod, quote, "Last week some 2,000 or 3,000 United States Marines, most of them now dead or wounded, gave the nation a name to stand beside those of Concord Bridge, the Bonhomme Richard, the Alamo, Little Bighorn, and Belleau Wood. The name was Tarawa." End quote. Legacy. Over 100 of the Americans were never repatriated. The remains of 36 Marines were recovered in March 2015, including First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman, Jr., who were all interred in a once-lost battlefield cemetery. Chief Rick Stone, while a member of the Department of Defense, investigated the cases of over 500 American servicemen who remain unaccounted for from the Battle of Tarawa, including 103 who are buried as unknown in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. The Chief Rick Stone and Family Charitable Foundation continues to research these cases for the families of the missing. In November 2013, the remains of 1 American and 4 Japanese were recovered from, quote, "what was considered a pristine site, preserving actual battlefield conditions and all remains found as they fell." End quote. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we do that. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of WikiSpeaks. Please feel free to leave a comment down below, and absolutely use those comments to leave any requests that you may have. Wikipedia is full to bursting with articles on as many topics as there are stars in the sky, almost. I would be honored to recite any articles you can think of. And on a side note, this article, The Battle of Tarawa, will be the first in a series that I'll be conducting in a new playlist I'll put on the channel, historical battles, conflicts, etc., Military history is most certainly my forte, and I absolutely love talking about it. I'll talk about it till I'm blue in the face to anyone that can bear listening to me drone on and on and on about it. But I think it is a very important aspect of human history that should be explored, is the history of famous battles and why they should never be fought in the future. But with that said, I'll close this. My name is Ospelak, and this has been WikiSpeaks. Go forth, librarians, and seize your knowledge.